Great. Just want to do a couple of quick reminders before we bring up our next guests. We'll get them to pull up on the screen some of the help support lines that are available. The Distress Center Crisis Line, 1-800-784-2433. And the Mental Health Helpline, 877-303-2642. And again, if anything triggers you today and you feel you need urgent attention or a voice or a support of hope, you can reach 911. Always a place to go. 3 numbers for you to find somebody and an ear to talk to and find some support and guidance as you move forward. So we're going to touch base a little bit later about a fundraising scenario that is going on with the Canadian Mental Health Association, a Sidney Crosby Team Canada jersey. So that's certainly something you're going to want to buy some tickets on as well. We are going to turn it over to our next 2 guests. And they're members of Our Collective Journey, which is a peer support group formed in Medicine Hat that encourages individuals experiencing health and addiction issues to step out from behind the heavy curtain. I love the word heavy curtain of shame. That is exactly the way it can feel. So the 2 founders are here with us today and have both experienced their own personal darkness and here to share some stories of resiliency and hope. Let's please welcome our next guests, Ryan Oscar and Rick Armstrong.
Well, here we are.
Here we are.
And just a quick shout out to our 3rd founding member, Damien. He's over in the Middle East today. He works in the Persian Gulf, so he's over there and couldn't join us today. But there is actually 3 of us. And Rick, why don't you tell everyone watching a little bit about what we do?
Well, Our Collective Journey, much like a lot of this mental health movement that we've seen in the community, stems directly, I think, from the results of the events of the last summer and the pressures of the pandemic, and that certainly didn't help anything, and especially in this region, I think it started with an economic downturn for a lot of the men specifically in our region, and we just heard a lot of stories of pain and recognized a lot of our stories and other people's stories, and kind of like everybody's been talking about, we just recognize that we're not talking about it, right? Yeah. Let's shed some light on this. Let's talk about it, and let's get some of that shame and guilt and embarrassment out of it. And it's not just that population that we visualize as people with having addiction and substance abuse problems. That more destitute population. It's everybody, right? It's your neighbor, it's your brother, it's your friend, it's your son, your daughter. It could be anybody. So just try to create a new, more open, honest conversation around those things.
Yeah, for sure. And I remember the day that I connected with you and Damien, and we discussed a lot of the things that were going on in this community and how a lot of people weren't recognizing these signs of these things that were happening. And all 3 of us sat down, and based on our lived experience, we were like, that's my story. That happened in my life. That happened as well, right? And we're no different than a lot of other people, right? The coping mechanisms that you and I had, we've talked about this many times, were very unhealthy coping mechanisms, right? For me, it was drugs and alcohol. And then other different behavioral addictions, for sure. I tried to fill everything before I really looked at the reason that these problems were there, and that was me. And that void in me that we talk about lots. And so, yeah, I remember the day that we got together and we started to form Our Collective Journey and wondering what we could do differently that isn't already being done. Because everybody in the community is doing their piece and doing it very well. And we thought, where are these gaps and what else can we do? And what kept me from reaching out at the end of my journey into that darkness was, fear and stigma, and fear of taking off that mask and letting that picture that I had painted for so many years, so everyone on the outside could see it and think, man, he is doing so well. It was to take that picture down and really address the main problems, and there was no way I was going to do that. And I don't know for sure, but I can guess that a lot of other individuals in this community and around people that are watching today are living behind that picture, right? And that's what took me to the very end and to that darkness. We decided, maybe the first piece we can do is start telling our stories in public, instead of just in certain areas and certain rooms and certain groups of people. Let's take this to the community and really tear the mask off this thing and tear the Band-Aid off and share this and show what, instead of the face of addiction, what does the face of recovery look like and what's possible when people are in recovery? And, as soon as we sat down and talked about that, I was 100% in.
Yeah, for sure. I think, in that moment, we absolutely recognized all of the agencies and all of the individuals and all the support that already exists, right? And not to say that they aren't doing a fantastic job. I think it's just a matter of capacity. And regardless of the programs that were out there, people were still losing this battle. And so obviously there was a gap somewhere. And when we sat down and we were talking about it, it was right after a big awareness event, right? And I remember talking to you guys about it and going, we're aware. Like, we're all aware. We can't possibly, especially in this community, we can't possibly be more aware than we were, that end of September time, right? But it kept happening. Mm-hmm. So it's like, well, we don't need awareness. We need action. We need something. We need to propel this forward. We need to, and we kind of joke about, getting off the bench, get in the game. We got to get in the game. And what does that look like? And so we tried to be, I know we talked a lot about, not stepping on toes and making sure that we're not duplicating services. And the big piece that I think we came back to is there's a ton of programs out there offered that are very valuable programs, and recognizing, these warning signs in others and family and friends, and there's lots of training that can be offered. But I know for me, my biggest issue was not recognizing those things in myself.
Yeah.
Right? At the end of my career, I don't know what you want to call it, right? The end of my debauchery, I was a daily, for sure a daily drinker, heavy. Drugs were a consistent part of my day, if not week, and deeply suicidal at the end, right? I was a burden. I was a burden to everybody and everything around me, and genuinely in a position that I thought the world was a better place without me. And even in that, I wouldn't have identified as having a drinking problem, a drug problem, or even a mental health problem. I'm a daily drinker, a frequent drug abuser, and suicidal, and I wouldn't have identified as having any problems at all.
For sure.
I was just a guy that really liked to party, and things didn't work out my way. And I think that was what the catalyst to get me reaching out, was hearing somebody else tell their story. And for years I had spent, for my whole life really, I thought I was different. I thought I was unique. I thought nobody understood the battles I had in my own mind and my own thoughts and my emotions. And I'd spent a whole lifetime playing different roles for different people, and I lost, I don't know if I even ever developed my genuine self. I was so busy playing roles for other people. And it wasn't until I heard somebody else tell the exact same story, and he ended his story with, and I'm an addict and alcoholic. And it was just this shocking eye-opener that if that guy's all of the things that if he feels all the things I feel, and he has all the same issues I have, and that's what he is, maybe that's what I am. And then he started talking about a solution to that. And I guess deep down I didn't want to die. And I was willing to try something different, right? And that's what led me down a really long path that, almost 5 years later, I'm here with, just this summer will be 5 years of sobriety, and I wouldn't trade it for the world.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, we've talked lots, you and I, and a lot of the details in our stories, and with Damien as well, right? They're different details as to what got us to where we were at the end, but man, all the feelings are the same that come with our stories, and that darkness and that hopelessness. And we joke about it all the time, how we can finish each other's sentences most of the time, right? When it comes to talking about that piece. And for me, I can relate to so much of your story, right? I grew up as a hockey player. I grew up under in a household that had loving parents, but a very, kind of that iron fist authoritative father. And, there was lots of times, and I know my mom's watching this. There's lots of times that...
I'm sure everybody's mom's watching
yeah,
this,
right?
at least.
High five to moms.
We at least got 2 viewers, I know that.
There was lots of times that I really despised my dad, but it was this weird dynamic where I loved him so much and wanted to be like him, so I wanted to follow his path, although secretly I hated him. And there was lots of days where, there was alcohol always involved in around our house as a youngster growing up, and so that became my normal, seeing that all the time, right? And nothing against, probably a lot of households are like that in this community and every other community around here, right? And that's what I grew up in, and that was normalized, and that just became the way I grew up. Playing hockey, same thing, right? Like putting that mask on. I was a prominent hockey player at a young age in our city, but still had this weird feeling that I was never good enough and never going to be good enough, and fear of failing because of all these high expectations set by, my dad. And I remember lots of days I could score 5 goals and get in trouble for going offside that day. That's all I would hear about, right? And I was just always trying to live up to this bar that was never going to be attainable for me, whether it was school or hockey or whatever, right? And then I found alcohol. And I always played hockey with a group of guys that were a little bit older than me. So I usually drank with those guys. And then I started recognizing how well that worked to shut that feeling off and to fill that void for a while. So, as the years progressed, I just started surrounding myself, didn't matter which team or where I played hockey, I started surrounding myself with those guys on the team. And some of those guys are watching today, and yeah, it's you. I know who you are. And I started surrounding myself, and then I felt normal in that group, right? I was never, like you said earlier, I never really thought I had a problem. I would drink daily and never think it was a problem because everybody was doing it, right? And nobody would call me on it because if he's got a problem, that means I probably have a problem. So, we're good. We don't have problems, right? And for me, it just escalated. Once hockey was over, back to the oil and gas industry, I went and started my oil and gas career, and I did the exact same things out there. I surrounded myself like that whole industry. It's common practice, the drinking and eventually drugs go hand in hand. And anybody who's been out there knows that that's not fake news. And for myself, I just surrounded myself with the heavy drinkers and the heavy drug users eventually, right? And just always fit into that one category, and I never had to deal with any of my feelings or that void. And as the years progressed and the fear behind having people recognize that maybe he's not the guy he thinks he is, or that he's putting up this big fake picture, I just always, we talk about it all the time, always was that guy who fought, who drank, who, womanized, did all these things so that I didn't have to be the person inside and feel those feelings, right? And that's that part about, you mentioned about feeling unique. And I did feel unique, and I see that, I recognize that in so many other people's stories. We all think we're unique. If you had my problems, you'd drink too, or if you, had all these outside issues, you'd do the same thing. But we all do have those issues, but we just, I don't know about you, but I didn't learn the coping mechanisms, how to deal with them in a healthy manner early on.
No, absolutely not. And I think a really important lesson that I learned early in my recovery, and it was only because people love me enough to call me on my BS, right?
Yeah.
And it was, I was really good at lying. I was really good at manipulating people. And it took somebody that seen me for who I was, and I was a drug addict and alcoholic. And they wouldn't buy into the BS. They just called me out on it, right?
Yeah.
And it was, at first I hated them for it, right? But like I owe those people my life that loved me enough to tell me the truth when I didn't want to hear it. And a pivotal moment for me is when I realized genuinely that drugs and alcohol were not a problem. They were my solution.
Yeah.
I was my problem. My problems were me. I didn't know how to act. I didn't know how to feel. I didn't know how to deal with anything, right? And for years and years and years, my only coping mechanism was to not feel, was to numb things out. And it terrifies me to think back at how many mornings I woke up consumed with guilt for my behavior the night before or the week before or at some point. And I remember waking up and looking in the mirror and genuinely hating myself.
Yeah.
Like I remember vocalizing that and going like, I hate you. I hate the person I've become. And not knowing how to deal with that. And the only way I could get through my day was to numb that out again. So as much as drugs and alcohol became a problem, they weren't, right? They were my solution. And like, I love drugs and alcohol, man. Like I honestly can look back on it and say that it probably bought me some more time. But when the only solution I've ever had for living life is taken away from me, it stopped working, and then it became a problem. I had no defense against anything, right? I was the problem, and there was no escaping it, and I had to deal with it. And actually, we were talking a couple days ago, and I've heard a lot of like one-liners from recovery programs and stuff, and it wasn't until you said just a couple days ago that, I'm going to butcher this. How'd you put it?
With the guilt.
The guilt, yeah. Guilt is I made a mistake.
Yeah.
And shame is I am the mistake.
Absolutely.
And when that switched for me, when that switched from I've made so many mistakes to just really deep down feeling like I am the mistake, I went from depressed and not in good shape to very much suicidal inside a few days.
Yeah.
Like it's terrifying how quickly that happened, right? That little voice that had been talking to me for all the years got really loud and became the only thing I heard. And I needed to reach out for help. And thank God there's programs and there's people and there's supports and there's phone numbers and there's things like this to answer that call when you need to make it.
Yeah, for sure. And I distinctly remember sitting with you that day when we talked about the guilt, right? And we had another individual from OCJ sitting with us that day, and we spent a lot of time talking about, for him it was anger, and everything that he expelled was in anger, right? And he talked about never getting to a suicidal place. And for us, you and I instantly relate to that, right? Like I was angry my whole life too, and I made a lot of mistakes, but it was all fueled by guilt, right? And that fueled the next mistake, and it was all booze and drug driven for me. But yeah, that window, for me, it was about 7 to 10 days where I went from, depressed, life is not very good right now, but I'm coping well because I'm using drugs and alcohol and getting through it. But when that switch turned and it started pointing the finger at myself, and it wasn't the mistakes I'd made and hurt everybody else, it was I am the mistake, that's when the suicidal ideations really took charge in my head. And that's when I started to entertain the idea that's the way out for me. And for me, it was, all these resources that are out there, I know they're out there, but when I was in that real dark moment at the end, man, it's one of the darkest things that I've ever been in. And we talk about that lots, that for me it was, the insides, I was in the, in the middle of the night, and the outside matched the inside finally. And that's the place where we talked when we first met, you, me, and Damien, that we sure don't want to see anybody else reach that point, because for me, that was very hard to move past that. And I, not getting too deep into our stories, if you ever want to hear them, check out our podcast, because we get really intense then. But for me, it was, how can we reach other people that we see these flags in, and these same characteristics and our stories are on the same trajectory? How can we reach those people before they get to that point? Because we both know that when we got to that point, it was very difficult to come out of it. And for me, what drove me to those points, like I said earlier, it wasn't, so much the drugs and alcohol, exactly what you said. That was my solution to get through, man, from 14 till I was 35 years old, was alcohol. And at right around those early 30 years, my dad, he passed away in a motor vehicle accident coming in from work one night, and I rode up on the scene and saw it all. And I had grown up underneath him as, he was my role model as to what a man would do, right? And I wanted to be a real man. It was taught to me early that Men don't ask for help. We don't talk about our problems. We sure don't mention feelings. And we solve all our own things. We're fixers, right? We fix things. And I can recognize that even today, right? I got to really focus on listening to understand, not to fix. And, after he passed away, I went back to work within a week because that's what a man would do. I had lots of people tell me, you should go see a counselor. You should do this, this, and this. And I'm like, no, that's not what my dad would do. In my mind, I'm thinking, and that is not what I'm doing. And I went back to work. And the way I got through that was I drank more, and I drank more often. And, I started to excel in my role there and move up the ladder. And quickly I found myself in front office positions there in a manager's position. And I didn't know how I ended up there. My life was still, I was chasing materialistic things. I was chasing money to fill that void. I was chasing, everything else that was out there. And for me, nothing worked long term. It was great. I had 5 TVs. I had this, I had that, a big house, brand new this and that. And nothing really worked long term until I found hard drugs. And once I found that, it was amazing. Like you said, that prolonged my life. And I'm not glorifying drug use because that really wasn't the problem. That was my solution as well, right? And that got me through the next X amount of years. But what I soon recognized was it took over my life so quickly that I never thought I had a problem, and then suddenly I did, and I couldn't quit. But I had built up such a big life that there was no way I could tell anyone about it because I was scared I was going to lose everything. And little did I know that was all going in the end anyway, but I was scared of losing, my job, my finances, my old life, and hurting my kids. And so that's when that decision, that's when that switch from guilt turned to shame, because I had hurt so many people in my life that I just thought I was a huge mistake, and there was no fixing it. I even entertained for a while, I can go live on Hastings Street in Vancouver. And little did I know, I've been to Hastings now, and I wouldn't have survived there a day, I'm sure, right? But that's when I really made that switch to put an end to it. And I can recognize that pain in a lot of people that we work with today that, they don't have an idea of what hope looks like or what recovery looks like, because if you're not exposed to it, which most people are never exposed to recovery or what recovery can look like, how are you ever supposed to know what you don't know, right? So that's one of the things we're doing here is really show people that what the face of recovery looks like, because it's wild. I remember being in those last moments thinking, when I went to treatment the second time, I went to a private treatment center, and I remember struggling with that idea, what am I going to do for the rest of my life without alcohol, especially because it's such a common thing, it's so acceptable in society. And up until 40 years old, I spent my 40th birthday in a treatment center. Everything revolved around alcohol in my life, whether it was camping, business meetings, holidays, you name it, had booze involved, right? And I just thought life as I knew it was over. And little did I know, right? Like how good life hadn't even really started for me yet. But at that time, it seemed impossible.
100%. It's like, we've told each other stories enough times that we know how they end. And for me, that jumping off point, if you want to call it that, the depth of my darkness, I remember being so desperate for a solution. At that point, I reached out to every professional agency I could get my hands on, anybody that would take my call, to some spiritual leaders that, was not at all commonplace for me, right? Just the desperation of a solution. I can't even begin to describe how desperate I was for a solution. And the consistent message from every professional, every spiritual leader, every single person I talked to was you need to start by forgiving yourself, right? That was the first step in the advice I was given. And the part I struggled with is nobody could really tell me how to do that, right? Yeah. It was so consistent yet so frustrating, because I'm like, how? If you knew the things I had done and the people I'd hurt, how could I possibly forgive myself? And, I guess fast forward a little bit into my recovery, I took the steps I took, and I did the things that I did, and I got involved with the groups and the people that I have, and I found my solution lies in purpose, right? And it not to say that I don't regret the things that happened, but I recognize they needed to happen exactly the way they did to make me the man that I am today, to give me this unique qualification of being able to sit across from somebody who has felt what I felt, and I get it. And I get it not because I read it in a textbook, but because I've been there. And that's what saved my life, is talking to somebody who got it, who really true empathy because they've been there, understood. And as soon as I made that my purpose, that self-forgiveness just kind of came, right? And that's when my whole life turned around, and I'm living. We talk about it a lot, right? And if I would have made a list of things I wanted the day I got sober and got them all, I would have sold myself short.
Totally. Yeah, for sure. And that piece you talk about is the piece that actually got me out of my darkness as well, was, that connection piece. And when I went back to treatment the second time, I had been to that treatment center 2 years prior. And, I'd gone I look back now, I did the best I could, I think, at the time, but I still really didn't think I had a problem. I could control this, I could control that still. It was this whole issue around control, and I can control myself because I'm a man. When I went back the second time, I'd pretty much burnt my life to the ground by that point, and, financially, emotionally, hurt lots of people. I was bankrupt, everything was gone. And all I had left was my word. And I remember talking to a counselor there who had 20 plus years in recovery himself. And, I was 2 weeks into that program, and I was still saying the magic words and, lip service pretty much. And he walked by me one day after group, and he kind of grabbed me by the arm and he pulled me aside and he said, if you want to keep lying to yourself, keep doing it. You're going to end up dead. And he said, when you're ready to get real, come and find me. And, I went up to my room that night, and that was the first time that I'd had an example of, this dominant male figure in my life who actually maybe cared, like genuinely showed compassion and empathy, and that lived experience piece that I had heard him tell, connected with me instantly. This guy gets it, and he knows the pain I'm going through. So I sat down with him, and we had a lot of thorough work from that point forward. And today, that is the first connection piece for me to somebody in recovery who had lived experience, but somebody I could relate to. Here's this dude that's, got some tattoos, and he'd been in a bike gang and this and that and on the streets. And I'm like, this guy gets the feelings that I have. And we sat down and we started to unpack all the guilt and the shame that I had carried for years. And he helped me separate, which parts I was carrying that weren't even mine to carry. And that's such a heavy thing. And anyone who's been to treatment or anything knows they have lots of different tools and techniques that you do. You carry the backpack with all these rocks in it and all that stuff, right? Once you start taking those rocks out that aren't yours, things get a lot lighter. And that's where I could start working through some of the shame. Once I unpacked that guilt and realized that stuff's not even mine to worry about anymore, now let's look at the shame piece, because I don't have to wade through all this guilt. And when he started to unpack that shame and walk me through that, and I could recognize that I'm not a mistake. This is what I did under the influence of drugs and alcohol, because I didn't know any better and I didn't have any coping skills. And, I'm not justifying any of the things I did, but I'm recognizing that, I really didn't have a chance at the start, and I'm willing to own it all now. And that's the biggest piece, is I'm going to own this stuff that I did. I'm going to recognize it, be accountable for it. And then I can start changing behavior that took me to those places, right? And by changing that behavior and that thought process, that's when, for me, I could start liking myself again. And up until that point, I didn't even know who I was. We've talked about that too, right? I really didn't know who I was. Most of the values I had up until that point were instilled on me from an early age, and I didn't even agree with some of them, but I ran with them. But yeah, it was that lived experience piece. And then, this is where some of our details change. I met someone in treatment who was going to do this cross-Canada bicycle trip, and we've talked about this lots before. And so I ended up doing this trip, and it took 3 months in 2015. But what that taught me were lessons and tools that I take with me still to this day in recovery, right? And every time I look back on that trip, I think of something different that trip taught me. And one of the biggest things that thing taught me was control. Up until that point, being a man, I thought I could control everybody and everything in my life. Once I got into recovery and started working on that piece, during that bike trip, you know, I had no control, and it was quickly brought to my attention that I had no control over anything except for how I packed my gear and where I pointed that front tire of that bicycle and how I rode it on the road. Everything else, from the traffic to the weather to the terrain, I had no control over anything. And that made that, you know, reframing of control really easy for me. Another thing it taught me was compassion for others, right? Our goal was to raise recovery awareness and what the face of recovery could look like, and do it personally for our own recovery and get out of society and figure out who I am. But along the way, we stopped and we started talking to different people on road stops and at gas stations, and within seconds, you could tell if they were interested in what we were doing, and within minutes, just having that empathetic ear of somebody who's been there, they started unpacking some of their stories to us, whether it was somebody in their family, whether it was them, whoever it was that was impacted by addiction or alcoholism, or they started talking to us. And there was days where we'd sit for 1-2 hours on a roadside and talk to these people. And that's where, you know, I had this light bulb moment. We laugh about light bulb moments all the time, but that's where I had one of them. Was like, man, I think I need to do this for the rest of my life, is help other people. And I know some of the programs that we're in, that's part of it, is we get well by helping others. And I thought, up until that point, 20 years in the oil and gas industry, that was who I was, right? That defined me. And it took a long time to reframe my thinking around that too, and all those limiting beliefs and those low self-worth stories I tell myself because of, you know, the way my brain works. I can do something different. Up until that point, I thought life was over. I had no life left. And that's when, at 40 years old, I decided, you're not too old to go back to school. I'm going back to college. I'm going to get some addiction counseling background. And I ended up getting through that. And now I get the luxury of helping people on the daily. It's an amazing, amazing part of my journey, is being able to work 24/7 if I want and help other people when they're suffering where I used to be. Because if it wasn't, like you touched on it too, if it wasn't for somebody else there who knew what I was going through, I don't think we'd be sitting in these leather chairs today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. And so I guess in my story of recovery, right about the time that you, for whatever possessed you, decided to ride a bike across the country, which I still think you're insane.
I had a psych evaluation that says I'm not.
You got the paperwork to prove
do.
it, eh? About the same time you did that in your recovery, I did nothing. I had the opportunity to move away and move out of the environment that I was in, and I left, and I ran from it, and I didn't want to take my past with me.
Right.
So I didn't do anything. I just cut out the booze and drugs and tried to live sober, but with no support, no peers around me, just not doing drugs and alcohol, right? And it took about a year, but I found myself in sobriety, suicidal again. And it really baffled me, right? Because I'm like, man, I'm clean and sober. I shouldn't feel this way anymore. And that's when that reframing came about for me of, you know, drugs and alcohol are not my problem, they're my solution. And if I take my solution away, I'm still just left with my problems, and I have I don't possess the skills or the tools to deal with any of it. And I reached out again to some people that had helped me the first time and kind of got re-involved with them, and again saved my life for the second time in sobriety. And the analogy that I got from one of the people that really helped me was, he's like, man, it's like going to the gym, right? You can want to get fit, right? You can want sobriety, you can want to get fit, but you're going to have to do something, right? I can show up to a gym 90 times in 90 days if I want.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get any of the results of it unless I pick up some weights, get on a machine, do something. I can want sobriety, but just not drinking and not drugging isn't really going to get me there. Mm-hmm. I need to do some things in addition to, right? And that's the action piece that I found. And at that point, I kind of reframed my life, much like you. I guess this is where we get kind of caught up. And being a man, being from Southern Alberta, like I don't think any of those things really factor into it, but I think it's more a societal thing that, it's competition, right? Like I need more, I want more, I need to show that I have more, I'm better than, I'm stronger than, and it wasn't until I just kind of conceded all of that and went, I just want to help other people, right? And that's where my solution lies, is that's how I am okay with me. And I constantly am checking myself and questioning my own motivations, because I can't trust my own brain. My own brain makes terrible decisions consistently still, right?
For sure, our best thinking got us there.
Exactly, right? I can't think my way out of a broken brain, right? It's just who I am. I need to take action. And so I professionally now, that's what I do. I work in the nonprofit sector. I help people in my free time. We started OCJ to try and help people, and as much as it's giving back, it's selfish, because this is what I need to do. I need to help people in order for me to stay in a good mental state, right? Yeah. And we joke about how this OCJ thing's like a multi-level marketing almost, right? We help somebody and give them the same tools and advice and support that we got, and send them out to help other people, because that's where our solution lies, right?
For sure.
So inevitably, as our team grows, our capacity grows, and that's where I think we start getting a societal shift into a healthier community, right? Is by incorporating more people into this program. Well, not program, but just mindset, right?
Yeah.
And helping people, and a little less of the me first mentality and the community-based thinking, and how can I be of service to somebody else today?
For sure, and I think we've talked about that lots, right? The problems and the front page news things that have been happening in this community over the last year. This is a societal or a community problem, and it's going to take society and the community to fix it, right? It's not just you, myself, Damien. It's not like this has zero to do with ego. We've talked about that. Like, we used to run our lives on ego, and that's what took us to the end. So, in order to be, for myself, in my experience, in order to be healthy and active in my recovery, I can't run on ego anymore. And that's where, surrounding ourselves with recovery-minded people and like-minded people really helps out. But, this isn't about us. This is more about, we joked about it. We wanted this to stay anonymous. We didn't even want to be associated, our names to it, right? But eventually it had to come out who we were and what we were doing and this and that actually propelled this even farther. But, that whole ego piece is something that it's not about us. This is about, we get well by being helped by others, and then we get to stay well by helping others on top of that, right? So by helping people, it's helping us in return, and it's this cause and effect, and it fuels our day, right? Going back to, some of the other things that in my past, one of the things that really helped me, along with the control issue, along with what I can control, that whole bike trip piece, my whole life I ran on fear. And I didn't recognize that till I got into recovery. I was so scared of failing, and so scared of people not liking me, and so scared of, not being that big, tough guy and all these things, and having people recognize that. A lot of my character was around anger, and I hung out with guys that fought all the time and drank all the time and stuff like that, right? So I didn't ever have to show that I was scared, because I had enough guys and enough anger and fear around me that people were scared. If we wanted to put that mask on, people were scared. And it wasn't until I got into recovery that this gentleman, and with some lived experience, helped me recognize that this was all fear-based, and I was not that person that I had portrayed for 30 plus years. I was this almost little scared little boy. And when I could start turning that piece around and recognizing that and working on being, pushing through that fear, that's where courage started to happen. Up until then, I thought courage was, let's go outside and it's a 3-on-6 bar fight. That's courageous. And that's nonsense now. I look back at those days and I think, man, that's such a bizarre mentality. But now it's like, okay, so here's something I've been scared of my whole life. Let's get into it and let's see what happens, because I'm not going to fail. And if it doesn't turn out my way, it's not a failure. It's a learning lesson for me. And I look at everything that way nowadays. And that helps with the fear. And B, maybe I am going to succeed. And that helps me, because up until I got into recovery, we've talked about this, I've started so many things in my life and never completed them. I started university. I started this hockey career. And I always almost self-sabotaged them with alcohol because I was scared of failing at them. And I recognized that looking back. I didn't know it at the time. I just thought it was somebody else's fault. And I look at that now and I think, man, I've started and never finished so many things that's one of my goals nowadays in recovery is if it's challenging, I'm not going to run from it. I'm going to try it and I'm going to do what I can. And I'm also going to ask for help. That's the easiest piece now for me is to ask for help. Whereas before that was the dirtiest 4-letter word I could have said was help. Now I ask for help all the time because, man, I've recognized that I can do things on my own, but man, it's so much easier if you're helping me. And if Damien's helping me or Alyssa or somebody in my life is helping me, it's so much easier to move through things. I don't have to do things alone and be that man. So pushing through those first instances of fear in recovery really started to build up that self-worth for me, which I had none of before, right? So once I started to build some self-worth and some self-confidence, things started to become a little easier. And I hear that lots in the recovery community and the therapeutic community that I work in today is that once you start doing that a little bit, you get this snowball effect and things will start snowballing, right? And I couldn't really understand that at the start, but now I recognize it easily. If I keep doing the next right thing, whether I don't succeed or I succeed at it, there's a lesson to pull from it and there's a learning opportunity there. And then I can succeed the next time and the next time. And that's where that snowball starts happening for me. And you know what? Until I got these tools in place, I was destined to never change my life. I was destined to be the man I was because I just thought I could control so many things and I could manipulate things and I could turn situations into my favor. And it was just not a healthy lifestyle to be living in. And it piled up that guilt and that shame and that remorse and just this vicious cycle we talk about, right? And once I got educated in addiction and the studies and the science behind it, the cycle of addiction, I could start piecing my story into that, scientific backed theory. And the addiction, that cycle, man, it was destined to repeat itself because I was never doing anything different. So you keep doing the same things and expect a different result. That's the definition of insanity. We hear that all the time. And I was completely insane because I ran my entire life on that cycle. Yeah, it's just crazy.
Yeah, it makes me, channel a little bit of Damien here and going back to the fear part, right? And I'm sorry if you're listening, buddy, and I might butcher this, but he says all the time, if I'm vulnerable, I'm weak, and if I'm weak, I'm worthless, right? And that was the mentality that he grew up with, and that's the mentality that I grew up with. And I found drugs and drinking, mid to early junior high school, which I think is pretty commonplace for people like you and me. And it's almost like I emotionally stopped evolving at the same time, right? It's like once I found that's where I emotionally stayed for the next 30 years, right? And I just never developed the skills to move on. And I was so terrified of being vulnerable or being weak because that's just my mindset. If I'm weak, I'm worthless. And what a complete... My only value is my vulnerability. Well, I shouldn't say that. That sounds terrible too. I've got a few values, I guess, but there's so much strength in that weakness and in that vulnerability, and that's what lets me get through my days. Maybe my story today, my vulnerability, gives somebody else permission to feel the same, to do the same, to speak their truth, and to ask for help. And it's not weak. It's that's the hardest thing, the scariest thing I ever did was try and get help.
Yeah.
And it gets me emotional now. It's still terrifying, right? But where I'd be without help, had I not recognized, had I not heard my story in somebody else's, I wouldn't be the father to 3 boys today. I wouldn't be the husband of my wife. I wouldn't be here with you. And I thank God that somebody was there to tell their story so I could hear it, so that I could find myself in that.
Yeah, dude. Amazing. Yeah, and I'm, so much similar to you in that aspect. If I wouldn't have heard that story from somebody, I don't know where I would be today. You know, in my darkest moment, you know, when I was at the end of the line for myself, and I know a gentleman who is watching this today saved my life. I truly believe that, or I wouldn't be here. My uncle found me after 14 hours isolated in a field, right? And I truly believe that's one of those moments that somebody was looking out for me and led him to me, because I had a bigger purpose on this earth. I 100% believe that now, and it was to help other people. And I've pretty much committed the entire rest of my life to that. I'm always going to be helping people in some capacity, because somebody was there to help me. And without that initial interaction with him, which led me, you know, the chain of events started then, led me back to treatment, led me to cross paths with this individual who had all this lived experience and his counseling background. And without that, I honestly believe I wouldn't be here today. And one of the other biggest pieces that I like to talk about when I share my story or my testimony is the mental health piece for me. Up until that point, you know, I was a little bit sad. That's all I ever thought, right? I was never too excited about a lot of things, but I was a man, and there was no way I was going to check in on that and figure out what that piece is. But once I got into recovery and I was at that treatment center, I got introduced to a doctor who, you know, he clearly stated to me, "Man, you have depression." And I'm like, "No, I don't. That happens to other people, not me." But, you know, we talked about it, and he talked about, really laid out and explained to me what antidepressants, SSRIs are, and this and that. And I said, okay, if it's going to help me, doc, I'm open to trying anything to get off drugs and alcohol. And that's, like you said earlier, that's all I wanted to do at the start. So I got on antidepressants. And, you know, that's over 6 years ago. And I still take that pill every morning. And I have no problem telling people that I'm on antidepressants. You know, for us, we talk about it all the time. The only way to start erasing that stigma and breaking that down is, I think, to normalize it. Let's talk about these things. Let's show people what mental health and addiction and recovery looks like. It looks like us. It looks like the butcher at the grocery store. It looks like, you know, so many different people. But nobody is really open to talking about it. That's why I love what we're doing here today. Like, we listened to Derek and Cody earlier. I've never really met two more open and vulnerable dudes, and I just met those guys in the last few months. But they feel like brothers, right? Let's start sharing these stories. Let's start chipping away at that stigma. Let's normalize this. And that's the only way I think we're going to get forward in this, in a different direction, because we keep, you know, we hear this all the time. We always hear, man, we got to do something. We got to do something. This shouldn't be happening. We got to do something different. Well, this is something different. Let's sit down. Let's talk about this. Let's rip the masks off, take the Band-Aids off, and tell people what is happening in our lives. And for you and I, it's a lot easier now because we've done this so many times. And part of our recovery, both of us, I know this is evident in your recovery, is that we've come to the place where we're okay with who we are today. And it really doesn't matter what people think of us. You know, everybody's entitled to their opinion. If you like me, great. If you don't, I'll stay in my lane, you stay in your lane, and I'll move on in a successful manner, and I'll wish the best for you. So when I break out these stories and I tell people what's impacting my life today and what has impacted my life and what I've done to navigate through that and to be successful moving forward, I only do that with hopes of opening that door, like you said, giving someone else permission to share their story and recognize, you know, if, like you said earlier as well, if that guy has that and this, and that, maybe that's what I am. And if he found a solution, maybe he's willing to help me find a solution, right? And this is something, we recognize this early on in our recoveries, that this is something that isn't going to be a magic pill. You know, I had that same gentleman in treatment. He told me, he said, if there was a magic pill, I know for a fact we would have taken 3 of them because that's our mentality, right? Our addictive thinking says if 1 is good, 3 is going to be amazing. And he also told me if I could fix you today, I wouldn't do it. And at that time, I thought, well, that's selfish. Why wouldn't you fix me? And he said, because you're going to miss all the learning lessons along the way of this journey in recovery, right? And I look back now and I think, that dude was so accurate with that statement because I have learned so many things, and they weren't all good things. I've learned a lot of hard lessons, but I've learned to look for, you know, this sounds cliche, and we hear this all the time in society, find the silver lining in that. And that used to be a foreign concept to me too. I'm like, how is there a silver lining in that mess? But there is. If I look back, I used to work with a guy who was the most egotistical, arrogant, his people skills, communication skills, the worst, bottom of the barrel stuff, right? And everybody hated working for him. And I look back now and I think, I hated working for him too and working with him, but I look back now and I think the lessons I can take from that is how not to treat people. If I'm fortunate enough for somebody to want to work with me or for me, I better be grateful for that, not to treat them like a dog or, you know, your neighbor's dog, whatever. Lots of learning lessons in every situation, and I'm fortunate today that I've had that recognition and that done the personal work to be able to be where I am today, to recognize those things and see that I have a lot of gratitude in my life today. I have a lot of cool things I'm grateful for, whereas before it was all stuff I could buy from a store, from a bar, from a magazine or a newspaper, right? It was nothing that I could accomplish on my own. And that gratitude today, that's how I start every day, is thanking, you know, for me, it's God. I thank God for all the gifts in my life. I pray for people today that I never would have even taken a second look at before. I would have wished harm against them. And now I'll pray for them and hope that they, you know, have a better life and hope that they find their way. And it's really reframed my entire way of thinking. But man, life today, you said it, you nailed it, right? We talk about that lots. If I would have got everything I wanted to at the start of recovery, I would have sold myself so short, because nobody 6 years ago could have told me I'd be sitting in a leather armchair across from you, surrounded by these awesome agencies and people, waiting for Thayer and Fleury to come to this building to talk.
No kidding.
I would have laughed and thought, that guy's drinking.
Yeah, and I know we're getting close to time here for us, and I guess the couple closing thoughts I want to wrap up with is, like the two guys that were sitting here before us. You know, I've known both Cody and Derek for 20 years almost, right? And I look back on 20 years of knowing some guys, and I don't know that I had a real conversation with them until the last year.
Yeah.
It's all been just superficial nonsense with no real, like, we used to just party and get messed up, right? It wasn't like there's no value to it, right? It was just fake. It was part of the persona, right? And it was everybody just holding up these personas, and now we get to this point that we're having like real conversations with real people, and it's like, man, why weren't we doing this for the last 20 years, right? And I think the biggest point that I want to make, and hopefully this whole event, this whole day, and every speaker and every agency presents, is you're not alone, right? In my darkest moment, I was there because I was unique, because I was different. Nobody understood me, and I was alone. And it wasn't until I gave voice to that and was willing to hear hundreds of other people tell their story that just so happened to be my story, and I realized I wasn't alone. And I guess that's what we're doing here, right? Is trying to tell our story so that people know you're not alone.
For sure.
You're not alone, and that's absolutely it. Thanks, gentlemen, Ryan and Rick, for sharing your story. Something that jumps out at me right away, listening to you guys talk. As somebody who speaks for a living, we work on this premise: story gives the strategy, strategy gives the steps, and the whole hook is the story. And I feel like today is all about sharing the stories, hoping that it gives people an opportunity to see that there are strategies, which then allow them to take the steps. Thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for being here today. I'm slated to do a little magic right now, and I thought maybe, just maybe before kicking the two of you out of here, we could torture you guys a little more with a little bit of magic. And I've selected two pieces that I want to do that I think maybe have some symbolism in terms of the event today. Would you like to do a trick with me?
Sure.
All right, excellent, excellent. I'm going to give you the pen there, Rick, if you will, and I'm going to give you the deck of cards, Ryan, if you will. Go ahead and give those a shuffle. Make sure they're good and shuffled. Is it possible to bring the camera in just a little bit on this? If we can get a little tighter and a little closer. And statistically, the more a person shuffles, the less they trust the magician, and I see where we're heading here.
I don't trust you at all. I've seen your magic. I'm about to get burned.
Excellent. Deck is completely shuffled by Ryan. Go ahead and grab any card you want. Rick, pull it right out, but do not let me see it. What I want you to do, listen very carefully to my directions. Pull the lid off the pen, And on the front side, so not the blue back, but on the front side of that card, I want you as big and as bold as you can, put your initials. Just make that card you. And we want that card to be you. At the end of the day, a deck of cards is 54 cards, 52 with 2 jokers. Each and every card is unique. And those unique cards is a lot like people. When we sit into a room with 54 people, there are 54 different stories and 54 different personalities. At the end of the day, there is one common similarity. They're all cards. We are all people, right? What I want you to do is, Rick, I want you to get lost in the deck here for me. So, Rick, we're going to get you lost into the deck. And the big key is that sometimes in our lives, I'll take the pen from you, sometimes in our lives we get lost in the deck. And when we get lost in the deck, we have nowhere to go. Or we feel we have nowhere to go. And the reality is there are tons of opportunities available to us. And we just need to be willing to reach out to those. And sometimes it's in the case of emergency, we need to find our help. And one of the things that's I'm going to draw attention to is this little glass box beside me right here. It's been here the entire time you're speaking. What do you see inside, Rick? Would you agree that is a folded playing card?
Looks
inside
like
there, a little sign
card.
inside that says for emergency use only. Rick, I'm going to get you to grab that card, and I'm going to get you to open that card up in front of the camera, Rick. And let's confirm,
This
Rick.
is terrible. This is witchcraft.
Is that in fact you, Rick,
That
right
is
there? Yes.
exactly my initials.
Excellent. And at the end of the day, if we feel lost and we feel like we're stuck in this stack and we're just sort of all alone, the reality is when we reach out for help and we break through those glass barriers, sometimes we find ourselves. And that's what I hope you take out of that trick here today. Again, big thank you to Ryan and Rick for being here today, being involved with this. Tell us a bit about our collective journey and how people can get in touch, follow along, or where we can go with that further.
You're a much better salesman than me.
Well, Our Collective Journey, you can find us on Facebook at Our Collective Journey. We're on Instagram at Our Collective Journey as well. We do dabble in TikTok a bit, but I wouldn't waste your time on that. Help at ourcollectivejourney.ca is another email address you can check us out on. If anybody has any comments, concerns, also our podcast, all major podcast platforms from Darkness to Life. We have some really cool guests on there, some shared lived experience, some professionals who are impacted by mental health and addiction. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, ever want to be on the podcast, I just want to thank Sandra, CMHA, you guys. I also work at CMHA, and this is one of the coolest events that I've ever been a part of. And I really hope that a lot of people hear and resonate with some of the messages today, because like Rick said, you're not alone. And a lot of agencies are here, and we're here as well. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much again, gentlemen. While we transition the stage, I'm going to present to the camera here. We're going to do another fun trick. Gentlemen, thank you very much again for your time. I want to do one more trick, and we're going to draw this trick in close, because an event like this is something that it's about bringing people together. And I want you to think of this scenario as these playing cards. At the end of the day, they're kind of loose and disjointed. They all have value, but the real value is in taking them and dressing them up a little bit and telling the story with these 3 cards. And I'm going to take these 3 cards just like this. I'm going to fold them, and we're going to tear the centers out, because we are going to make them into card rings. Now, in a card game, each one of these cards has tons of value. But now that they're rings, they seem like they've got holes. They might be a little weak, flawed, or maybe have some trouble. At the end of the day, though, when you take these cards, which do not feel, look, or happen to act whole, and you put the magic together and you reach out, you can actually create a link. You can create some magic and some connection. The real magic is when you can tear through those barriers and you can show that the strength and the magic in that wisdom is really all there for you the minute you reach out to others, share your story, connect and link with the organizations and the people that are around you. And there are tons of them. So I hope you take that idea and that thought and you move forward with it.